O author of authors, sire of heroes upon the sea, what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches now towards San Diego to be born? Dear reader, I bring before you Captain Jackson Quintilius Harvey, man of all men, lusus naturae, that is, freak of nature, and not so solitary victim of neverness. His ancient infirmity dates to before mankind, to before the ocean, or the earth, or the heavens, when nature was all alike, a shapeless chaos of rude and lumpy matter. Behold a man who houses a physical vacuum within the walls of his skull, a black hole of non-knowledge which, if released by a cranial fracture, would swallow all of creation. Unable to maintain any personality for an extended period, he takes on the character and spirit suggested by his surroundings. Such is the unusual and blessed creature that I, Roland V. Twelves, author of this immortal tale, have chosen to set loose on the modern-day city of Leucadia, California. As noted, Harvey's illness enabled him to assimilate a variety of personalities with equal facility, and as he wandered along the sidewalks of residential Leucadia, he took on the character and mannerisms of each creature he encountered. First he was a gardener, then a schoolboy on a skateboard, then a terrier chasing and killing a cat, then a butterfly, then a rap star twitching and jerking to a monotonous single beat. An American on a whaling ship noticed his fall and sailed to the rescue. "Icarus?" he asked, when he pulled the captain aboard. Harvey was mumbling as he wrung the water from his clothes. "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow seeps in this fishy taste from day to day, till the last mouthful of foamy brine, and all my yesterdays have filled my frame with useless breath. Out, out, brief echo, my mouth is but a talking shadow, a carbon copy that chokes and coughs in the spray, and then is heard no more. It is the mouth of a counterfeit, full of kelp and algae, masticating nothing." The American looked at him in astonishment, and at once concluded, this man would have been as great as Marlowe, if only he hadn't lived so long. Then, after a brief silence, he added, "But not so great as Clemens." "I'm Mahogany Edwards," said Harvey, introducing himself. "Mahogany Edwards?" said the American. "So am I." The two were astonished that, in such a remote place, they had both met someone they knew, and they carried on a spirited soliloquy for the better part of an hour. Harvey, after his flight, spoke with an infinite clarity. "My head is a mental vacuum," he said, "that inhales whatever it encounters." "A mental vacuum?" said Mahogany. "You mean you are everything and nothing?" "Exactly," said Harvey. "Everything and nothing," repeated Mahogany. "Everything and nothing," echoed Harvey. "I," said Mahogany, dropping his glance and scuffing at the deck, "am a yuppie. Or at least I was, before my fiancée left me and married the owner of a California sanitarium. After she left, I sold my La Jolla condo and BMW and bought this ship. It took me 33 days to sail from Cape Cod to Algeciras, and I had hoped to drown along the way, but when I saw death face to face, I was afraid." On the bench next to him, a young woman was reading a copy of El Ingenioso Hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha. When Harvey moved near enough to take on the woman's personality, he found himself vicariously reading that delicious chapter in Part II that recounts the arrival of Sancho Panza and Don Quixote at the Duke's palace. The Duke and Duchess, having already read Part I of the novel, and being acquainted with Don Quixote's extraordinary delusion, have decided to humor the misguided knight-errant, and entertain him and his squire as if they are indeed who they pretend to be. The woman stopped reading, and Harvey was jarred by a sudden revelation. Maybe he was mistaken about his illness. Maybe it was not that he was constantly imitating others, but that others were imitating him. Certainly, if the universe and all things in it were created from the void before time, then all personalities might have come from the void before the first personality, from a mental vacuum, as it were, not unlike his own. The world and all the things in it might simply be imitations of his infinite possibilities. Any costume was appropriate, because Harvey played all parts and all parts portrayed him. Inevitably, the world that had determined him had chosen him as their model. The woman continued reading, and a rush filled the captain's already teeming brain. Too many words, thought Harvey, and attempted to concentrate on just one. Out of the swarming pool he chose the word it. He paused to consider its possible meanings, and once again he was struck with the idea that he was being imitated. This time it was a word, it, a word that could be everything, anything, and nothing. He reflected that the various meanings one word carried might proliferate to such an extent that within 100 years a handful of words could describe all of creation. Eventually, it could be reduced to a single one. Harvey paused. If one word were enough to contain all description, would not one man be sufficient to contain all men, perhaps even all things? And might not that one man be himself? He was chilled by the thought of his mortality. If he died, and was indeed the source and end of all things, what would remain after his death? Harvey glanced up to meet the eyes of a passing gentleman whose life was an imitation of his, and whose life Harvey in turn was now imitating. Harvey considered that every person was indeed like himself, and that every death brought with it the annihilation of all things. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Mahogany awoke on the way to Nice. The modern trains ran more quickly than the old ones, but despite the 20 years that had passed in the cave, the compartments were essentially unchanged. They consisted of 6 seats, 3 facing 3, with luggage racks overhead and a sliding door opening to the aisle. Harvey was nestled in the corner against the aisle wall, and Mahogany was diagonally across from him, leaning his head against the window. The tracks followed the coast, and Mahogany could see the swelling mass of the Mediterranean rise and roll, tearing into thin white breakers that flashed in the dark. He remembered his transatlantic voyage, leaving Cape Cod, uncertain of his course, drifting in the obscurity of his soul. More than once he had been tempted to abandon ship and, setting his foot upon the hills of water, let the earth drop from beneath him. After his loss in San Diego, he had been as a man overboard. Life went on for others. The ship did not stop. The wind was firm. The course must be kept. But he was left behind, appearing and disappearing, plunged beneath the surface. He called out and extended his arms, but no one could hear. He saw the disappearing sail, He had been there moments before, had been one of the crew, had moved upon the deck, had enjoyed his share of sun and sky. He had been a living man. Then he slipped. Now he was drowning in the monstrous deep. Beneath him, the engulfing abyss. Around him, darkness and storm. Within him, horror and fatigue. He was paralyzed by the cold. His hands clutched spasmodically, grasping nothing. Life was pain, and he longed to abandon the fight and slip into the rolling dark. Oh, misère misérable! Oh, implacable march of human interaction, destruction of hearts and souls marking its path. Abyss where all fall, betrayed by a kiss. The sea is the inexorable night into which the heartless cast their victims. It is the measureless misery. The soul that sinks there will become a corpse. Who will restore it to life? Occasionally the train would leave the coast and weave inland. A spattering of street lamps would announce the approach of a small town, and the main road would come into view. Running parallel to the tracks, the street would pass the all-night stations and stores, then branch into other roads, diverging in the distance. Pulling out of the town, the lights would vanish and the roads would become one again, and Mahogany would continue to stare, registering the night's reflections and following the random thoughts they triggered in his mind. When they pulled into Marseille, the train was too long to fit into the station, and Mahogany's car did not reach the platform. It began to rain, and he gazed out the window through the drops that streaked the glass. He heard voices in the distance, people running, a family. They were stirred and excited, sparked by the energy of the night. They rushed from the station to their car. They laughed. He heard the doors open and close, and he imagined the commotion as they settled into their seats. He could smell the clean fragrance of dark, damp hair. Then the motor roared, and he saw 2 headlights peer into the glistening river of rain. When the train left the station, Mahogany thought of Beatrice. It was only 2 days since he had seen her, but it seemed like 20 years. For her it had been 20 years, and Mahogany tried to imagine how she would look, but saw her only as she had been, getting on the bus. He remembered the slenderness of her hand as she reached for the rail, and he imagined the play of gravity as her weight moved from heel to ball to toe. He remembered the line of her calf as she paused, one foot on the bus and the other on the ground, and how she pushed up, bringing both feet onto the step, then vanished and reappeared at the window. He remembered her eyes. The sea continued to toss, and Mahogany relived their evening encounter. He could linger now in the contemplation of her olive complexion, the curve of her lips, and the flash of her smile. A lock of hair, damp in the warm night, had clung to her neck beneath her ear, and when she brushed it back with a wave of her hand, the dampness left a glow of perspiration on her skin. He admired the fine line of her eyebrows. He observed how her hair grew evenly from her temples and forehead, and how the tips had become tinted red by the southern sun. When she pulled the locks back, running them through her hand, the darker strands beneath washed over her with a dramatic blackness. Then the tinted strands fell on top, streaking and lighting her inky mane. Where was she tonight? Among what people? Saying what things? Dreaming what dreams? After a while Mahogany dozed off, and when he awoke he was alone in the compartment. It was morning, and Helios had begun to drive his chariot across the sky, casting a golden path on the water and painting the undersides of the clouds. It was one of those rare dawns that occur at every moment at some place in the world, and Mahogany was moved. He wondered, as all people do, if others felt his same emotion. He reasoned that either no one could feel what he felt, or else everyone could. Both considerations seemed unsatisfactory. The first was a solitary one, impossible to share, and the second was vulgar, destroying the moment's sublimity by attenuating it at the hands of the masses. He preferred the first alternative, considering his experience to be of unparalleled depth, reserved expressly for himself. They were almost to Nice when Harvey returned to the compartment, mumbling about the interminable line to the bathroom. For Harvey it had been interminable, because no sooner had he relieved himself and left the WC than he was confronted with the next person waiting to get in. When Harvey took on the person's character, he inherited their urge as well, and was inspired to rejoin the line and wait for another turn. Harvey might have gone on forever in this infinite loop, except that on one occasion he happened to exit just as a woman stepped out of the adjacent WC, and her own great relief so overwhelmed Harvey that he was carried with her into the corridor and back to his compartment. At 8 o'clock in the morning they arrived in Nice. But when they stepped off the train, Harvey was swept up in a river of travelers that were boarding a train on the adjacent track, and Mahogany was forced to get on as well. It was a local train that ran along the Mediterranean at 100 feet above sea level and made stops at each town from Nice to Ventimiglia. From the window they could see the local fishermen on the rocks, dangling their lines into the breakers. Mahogany was about to comment on the beauty of such a simple, carefree life, when the compartment suddenly went black. "Hi!" yelled Harvey. "Phaethon has lost the chariot and plunged his horses into the sea." A moment later, the train emerged from the tunnel it had entered, and the sun returned. The entire journey from Nice to the Italian border passed through a series of tunnels cut into the rock, and each time the train entered and emerged, our heroes were deposited above one small bay after another. Sometimes they could see boats and homes near the water, other times only a simple footpath, and others only the virgin rocks and trees. The scene alternated from sun to shadow to sun, like a photograph or a series of photos splashed across the film of the mind. By the end of their journey along the Riviera, Mahogany had learned to accept the darkness and wait for the light at the end of the tunnel, living on the dream of light behind and the promise of light ahead. During one interval of light, he spotted some men playing boule near a small town and convinced Harvey to get off. At 3 minutes past 9 o'clock, Mahogany and Adelphine left the Hotel Nippon de la Concorde and started up the Champs-Élysées. She was pretty, and they walked to l'Étoile and back to the hotel. The narrator breaks in. "What? What is this? O marvelous mixer of tales, peerless painter of illusion and light, what paltry picture is this? She was pretty, and they walked to l'Étoile and back to the hotel? What delirious fever has obscured your soul, letting slip this colorless whisper of shadow sound? Speak, speak now, and defend thyself. O reader, dear reader, just critic and touchstone that tests the metal of my work, I kneel now in shame on both knees, one hand covering my eyes, and the other my mouth. I reverently beg your most gracious forgiveness, though aliquando bonus dormitat omerus, I swear on the sword of my quill, I will awake from this starless slumber and hurl myself again to the magical bliss of illusion. At 3 minutes past 9 o'clock, Mahogany and Adelphine left the Grand Hotel Nippon de la Concorde and started up the Champs-Élysées. A tender breeze washed gently down the walk, catching the hem of Adelphine's white cotton dress and making it dance and curl above her ankles. The afternoon rain had left a sprinkling of drops on the leaves. They fell now, one by one, catching and lighting in the artist's hair and lashes. The boardwalk paralleled the street at a distance of several meters, and its tiles were worn with the restless habit of the feet. Mahogany felt an inexplicable easiness with Adelphine. She seemed to understand his every thought, anticipate his every word, and share his every dream. Only one person was half as pleasant as she, and that was the captain. Suddenly, Mahogany smiled. "Where were you born?" he asked. "In Mantua," she said, "but my mother is from Brindisi. She is a descendant of the Duke of Bavaria and named me after his daughter." "Have you ever been to the States?" said Mahogany. "Never," she said. "Really? But your English is perfect. How long have you studied?" "I never studied," she said. "I've always been able to speak what is spoken to me." "Can your parents do the same?" said Mahogany. "My mother can't," she said, looking down at the smooth tiles and scuffing her heels. "And I don't have a father. My mother says I was a virgin birth. She went to Spain one spring and was pregnant when she returned to Italy. She moved to Mantova to live with my grandparents and have the child, and was so ashamed she never went back to Brindisi." Mahogany had guessed right. This 19-year-old princess was Captain Harvey's daughter. She was born of an ordinary mother, and therefore shared only some of Harvey's remarkable capabilities. But it was immediately apparent that what she had inherited from her mother was equally remarkable. Her every movement bespoke the elegance of Italy. It was there in the stride of her step, there in the harmony of her hands, there in the alchemy of her eyes. The city's refusal to outlaw diesel fuel had killed many of the most beautiful trees in Paris, but some were still healthy, and a stretch of the promenade passed peacefully beneath a fine line of maples and chestnuts. At this early hour everyone was headed to the center. There were other couples that sauntered along with them, keeping time to the same lover's rhythm. There were larger groups that passed quickly and noisily from behind, and there was an occasional solitary gentleman, walking slowly, passed by all the rest. In the intimate shadows, Mahogany took Adelphine by the hand. She turned to smile at him, and the gentle motion tossed her long black curls across the white shoulder of her dress. Mahogany sighed. These were not the artificial, chemical-damaged curls of the salons. These were natural, deep, and shining. When they reached the Pont Ronde and the lights of the shops and cafes, Mahogany wondered whether to release her, but she answered with an affectionate squeeze, and they continued hand in hand. Surrounded by tourists from all across the continent, Mahogany began to feel quite European, and he asked Adelphine to speak to him in Italian. She joyfully consented and began to describe everything she saw. She called attention to the crystal windows of the stores, pointing out the advantages and disadvantages of each new fashion. She translated the conversations of various groups in the cafes. She stopped to imitate the slang expressions of students eating burrito supremes at a taco time. C'est bacchanal, mon ami, vachement bacchanal. She mimicked the now serious, now silly mannerisms of the men and women that passed. She turned, paused, discussed her next move, set off in a different direction, laughed, smiled, wove through the crowds, and carried Mahogany with her in the wake of her motion. When they passed the Café Gerbois, they spotted Harvey. He was sitting with his sons. They had gathered in imitation of the traditional artistic cénacle, and were discussing any and all questions of artistic merit. Several critics were with them, listening with passionate intensity. Eventually, Adelphine and Mahogany stopped at a café at the edge of the avenue and sat at a table for two. Adelphine addressed the waiter in perfect Parisian French and ordered a bottle of their best champagne. "Il faut célébrer l'exposition," she said, touching her glass to Mahogany's. "À notre santé." "Mais oui," he replied. The evening had moved past illusion and was now approaching a level of enchantment unknown to man. The questions Mahogany asked and the answers Adelphine gave were utterly irrelevant. Words had lost their meaning. There was only the sound of her voice, the dance of her hands, and the spark of her eyes. She could have been explaining how to dismantle a vacuum or how to change a filter, and to Mahogany it would have seemed the most romantic narration imaginable. After the first glass of champagne they moved their chairs together and, holding hands above the table, sat for hours, speaking with only their eyes. At exactly 14 minutes to midnight they decided to continue to the Place de l'Étoile, and they descended to the underground walkway. When they surfaced beneath the Arc de Triomphe, they found a flame burning at the grave of the unknown soldier, and Adelphine reached out her hand. "Careful!" cried Mahogany. "Don't worry," she said, placing her hand in the fire. "It's a simple question of becoming one with the other. For what creature would attack itself?" Mahogany was startled, but his astonishment soon passed as they began the walk back. Then his mind turned to other thoughts, and when they left the lights of the shops and cafes, he kissed Adelphine beneath the arms of a chestnut tree. Part 2, Chapter 4, in which Harvey attacks himself. Quote, "Omnis mundi creatura quasi liber et pictura nobis est et speculum." From Vincent de Beauvais' Speculum Quadruplex. Every creature of this world is to us a book, a picture, and a mirror. After their drink on the terrace, Harvey and Roland walked down to the bay. The sun was still high in the sky, and its unimpeded rays reflected brightly on the rocks of the coast. As soon as they reached the shore, the captain tore off his clothes and leapt into the water. It was another world. The dry heat was gone, replaced by a turquoise cool, and 1,000 types of fish and sea creatures rushed to meet him. Moving like a prehistoric eel, he coasted over an underwater cliff and watched as the ocean floor fell away beneath him. He felt as if he were flying, sailing upon the bosom of the waves, high above the white upturned eyes of the fishes that gazed in wonder. Halfway across the underwater canyon, a 20-foot white shark coasted into view. Overcome with the ferociousness of the beast, Harvey dove at him and bit his dorsal fin. The shark spun around and tore off the captain's right arm. "Arrgh!" cried the captain, bobbing to the surface. The fight that ensued might well have been the most ferocious in history. Even the tourists on the beach could tell there was something remarkable taking place beneath the thrashing white water. At one point, Harvey clamped his molars on the soft underbelly of the fish, and the shark leapt out of the water. "Jaws!" cried the bathers, rushing to safety. As the fight continued, the two moved closer and closer to the shore. A headstrong British child, in direct defiance of his mother, refused to leave the sea, and the shark headed straight for him. Harvey noticed the attack and swam to the rescue, grabbing the boy in his teeth and swimming to shallow water. As soon as he was out of danger, the child turned back and taunted the departing fish. "You think you're so mean," he said. "Well, I showed you." Harvey, still sharing a touch of the shark's personality, leapt on the young braggart and tore a pound of flesh from his left gluteal. While the boy limped off crying to his mother, Roland helped Harvey to the shore. Harvey dreamt that his skull had been opened and the universe drawn into it. He dreamt a gigantic dream, a dream of millions of delightful and terrifying acts, all together in a single, inseparable moment. He dreamt an infinite number of objects, and each object was infinite objects, for he saw them from all points of view. He dreamt the heavy-laden sea. He dreamt the dawn and the dusk. He dreamt himself in the times and places he had inhabited in parts 1, 2, and 3, and in the places he had not inhabited, but which existed in him by his existing. He dreamt a tragic ending to his novel, and he dreamt a happy one as well. He dreamt clusters of grapes, drifts of snow, torrents of rain. He dreamt all of nature, and that the earth and the heavens were fashioned from him, and that he was fashioned from the earth and the heavens. He dreamt all the deserts of all the planets, and each grain of sand in them. He dreamt a newborn baby in Biafra, and the spittle that dripped from its cheek. He dreamt a villa in Lombardy, a handwritten copy of Don Quixote, and the body and eyes of Alessandra. He dreamt night and day simultaneously. He dreamt all the sunsets of the world as seen from every point on earth. He dreamt a mirror, or himself, standing in front of a mirror, or himself. He dreamt the delicate shadow of a leaf in autumn. He dreamt the circulation of blood in his hand, and in the hands of all men. He dreamt his own face. He dreamt your face. He dreamt the dream he was dreaming. He dreamt a hole that swallowed all holes. He dreamt the eyes of a spider and the smile of his Savior. One night Harvey's tale was cut short, for Elio had fallen ill with fever, and Agnese insisted he turn in early. Though the neighbors who had stopped in were disappointed, Agnese managed to shoo them out, and when they went upstairs, Harvey remained behind. Staring into the fire, he quickly lost himself in the undulating light, until a noise drew his attention to the shadows behind him. It was Fiammetta. She was standing in front of the back wall, loosening her bodice and letting her dress fall to the floor. She emerged from its folds like a mermaid emerging from the sea. "Arrgh," growled the captain. "I have slept with mermaids in caves by the sea, until human voices wake us, and we drown." Free of her robes, Fiammetta crouched to the floor and, crawling on her hands and knees, made her way toward him. Her hair was long and wild, falling over her shoulders and covering her breasts, and brushing against her hands as they moved across the floor. Harvey could see the curve of her back as it dipped and rose to her hips, and the roundness of her bottom that was illuminated in the glowing light. She did not approach him directly, but went instead to the fire, where she rose to her knees and set another log on the grill. Then she motioned for him to undress, and made a bed of his clothes. At first they sat, feeling the heat of the fire on their naked knees and faces. They watched as the finger of a flame curled around one of the ends of the log, then was joined by others, catching at the corners and licking the bark with their glowing tongues. The pockets of air began to pop and whistle, sending small fireworks from the hearth. Then the couple moved back and lay down, and the caressing began. Just as the flames had awakened the wood, so Fiammetta's fingers set fire to Harvey's skin. Slowly, starting at the edges, wrapping and unwrapping, she ran her hand the length of his leg, curling at his calf, while his hand began at her waist, climbing to her breasts, then continued to her shoulder and neck, rising and disappearing in her hair. As the loving mirrored the flame, the silent Fiammetta, poor and out of place in society, became confident and secure. For this was no play act of premeditated passion. This was two animals, spontaneous and unreined, two mammals entwined, skin to skin and breath to breath. The loving burned yellow, blue, and white, devouring everything in reach, filling the night with love's sound and smell. In the hearth the bark fell away, and the glowing heart was exposed. Then the rocking began, wave upon wave upon wave. The undulating glow continued, moving through the wood, until a once sturdy log became pumice light, a shriveled shell in the shadows. Then the purring Fiammetta, unable to suppress her feminine nature, broke the silence and spoke. "Yes 3, no yes?" she said. "Yes, no 11, yes 2, said Harvey with surprise. "Yes 2, no 5? She asked with excitement. "Yes," he replied. She wasn't dumb after all. She was simply speaking a language that no one understood, a language which Harvey, sharing her personality, spoke as if it were his own. It was really quite simple, she explained. I realized that one word was not enough, for it could not differentiate between one thing and another. So I added a second actor to the stage, and suddenly anything was possible. Logically, I chose the words yes and no, and then it was quite easy to create my language of opposites, and I named everything in those terms. There is yes 3, no yes 2, which is the animal that men ride, and yes 2, no, which is the wet thing we get from the fountain, and... As she went on, Harvey realized Fiammetta was not only not dumb, but she was the smartest person in the entire town. She told him, in fact, that she had always considered the others to be ignorant because they could not comprehend her language, and she was mystified why they had invented so many unnecessary words when 2 were enough. As Harvey paused to reflect, a spark leapt from the fire and landed on the floor next to him. "Yes 2, no 5, yes? Yes 2, no? Yes, no 3, yes 71? asked Harvey. "No," said Fiammetta. "Yes 3, no 2, yes 2. Yes, no 77, yes 51, yes 2, no." "No?" he asked with surprise. "Yes, no 69, she said. "Yes, no 69? he asked with excitement. "Yes, 69, she cried, and they fell to loving again. Night after night the ritual continued, Fiammetta remaining while the others had gone, beginning their secret colloquium of passion, while between climaxes they conversed with numerical perfection, expounding the concept of Aleph naught and countable infinity, and offering as proof an infinite shuddering within. All the worries of all the people that had ever lived suddenly seemed meaningless. The worries Harvey had experienced when taking on different personalities, whether he was hated or loved, whether he had plagiarized others or not, the pressures Ariana had known, growing up in a small town where women had to be beautiful and proper, the pain of emptiness in a world filled with people longing to find love, the trials of the present and the fears of the future, all of them disappeared, and for one single moment a man and a woman sat side by side and were content. Harvey felt a sense of fulfillment and loss, as if he had never been alone, unable to remember the emptiness that had been his companion only a moment before. The weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, and though neither Harvey nor Ariana knew what their future would hold, how long they would be together, or if their story would go beyond this one present page, for now it did not matter, because they knew they were where they belonged. Ariana turned to Harvey and took his hand. "Que carina manina," she said, and smiled. My God, he thought, a whole moment of happiness. Is that not enough for the sum of a man's life?